Cowboy saves, hanged native woman, 30 riders. Come at dawn. Have you ever stood in a crowd and felt the weight of 100 eyes demanding blood? High noon in Bitter Creek came with a fury the town hadn't seen in months. The sun hung like a copper coin in a white sky, bleaching the color from everything except the red dust that swirled through the square. The air itself felt thick, unbreathable, as if the heat had turned solid. And, in the center of it all, beneath the oak tree that had witnessed 30 years of hangings, stood a woman who refused to die quietly. Her name was Ayanna, though the crowd didn't bother with names. To them, she was simply the Apache spat out like a curse. She stood tall on the wagon bed, broad-shouldered like a young pine, her bare feet planted wide against the weathered wood. The noose circled her throat, rough hemp, already cutting into brown skin, but her eyes blazed with something the mob couldn't understand. Not fear, not pleading, just a cold, steady defiance that made some men look away. "Hang her," someone screamed. "Let the savage die." Deputy Morrison stood beside the wagon, one hand on the rope, the other waving to the crowd like a carnival barker. His smile was wide, teeth yellow in the sunlight. He'd waited 3 days for this moment, ever since the Apache riders had delivered her bound and silent to the town jail. 3 days of watching her refuse food, refuse water, refuse to speak a single word in English or Apache or anything else. 3 days of building the crowd's hunger for spectacle. "Good people of Bitter Creek," Morrison shouted, "today we rid ourselves of a blight." This woman defied her own kind, brought shame to her tribe, and stands accused of refusing the sacred bonds of marriage. Even the Apache don't want her. So why should we? The crowd roared approval. Rocks clattered against the wagon. A woman spat the glob, landing on Ayanna's bare shoulder. She didn't flinch. That's when the wagon rolled to a stop at the edge of the square. Silas Walker had only come to town for salt, nails, and coffee. Maybe some tobacco, if the price was fair. He'd been riding since dawn, the long miles from his cabin, marked by silence and the creak of leather. He was a man carved from hard years' gray eyes, set deep beneath a weathered hat coat, dusty from the trail hands, calloused from work that never ended. He'd fought in the war. He'd buried a wife. He'd learned that most days the world just kept turning whether you wanted it to or not. But when he reached the square and saw the woman on the wagon, the noose tight around her throat, something in him went still. He'd seen hangings before. Too many. Quick drops in army camps, slow strangulations in border towns. He'd learned to look away, to let justice or vengeance or whatever men called it happen without him. But this time his hands wouldn't loosen on the reins. This time his eyes locked with hers. She looked at him, not begging, not asking, daring him. The moment stretched thin as wire. Morrison raised his hand, ready to slap the horse and send the wagon rolling forward. The crowd held its breath. And Silas made a choice. He dismounted slowly, boots hitting the dust with soft thuds. His hand moved to his belt, fingers wrapping around the worn handle of his hunting knife. No one noticed at first. They were too busy watching Morrison, too hungry for the spectacle. Silas walked through the crowd like smoke, quiet and inevitable. Then he lunged. One clean stroke. The knife flashed in the sunlight and the rope snapped with a sound like a breaking bone. Ayanna dropped, gasping, hitting the wagon bed hard enough to crack the wood. The crowd went silent. Morrison's mouth hung open, hands still raised in the air. Silas stood beside the wagon knife, gleaming red with the reflection of dust and Sunday. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried. "She's done." Chaos erupted like a kicked anthill. Men reached for guns. Women screamed. Morrison's face went purple with rage as he yanked his Colt-free barrel, swinging toward Silas. Colter Morrison roared, using Silas's old name from the war. "Do you even know what you just did? That savage was meant to die, and you just kicked dirt in the face of the law?" Silas pulled his Winchester from the wagon in one smooth motion. He didn't aim at Morrison. He didn't aim at anyone. He just fired once, straight up into the white sky. The crack was thunder. Horses reared. The crowd scattered like birds cursing, stumbling, backing away from the square. Morrison stood, his ground pistol trembling. "Fine," he spat. "Take her. But know this, Colter. Tonight, I'm coming. Me and the whole damn town." Silas didn't answer. He turned, lifted Ayanna from the wagon bed. She was heavy, solid muscle and bone, but she didn't resist. Her legs buckled beneath her rope, burns raw and bleeding around her throat. He half-carried, half-dragged her to his own wagon, lifted her into the bed among the sacks of salt and coffee beans he'd never bought. Rocks clattered off the wagon wheels as he drove away. Jeers followed them out of town, fading slowly into the sound of hooves on packed earth and the woman's ragged breathing behind him. Silas didn't look back. Behind them, Morrison stood in the empty square, still gripping his pistol, watching the wagon disappear into the heat shimmer of the horizon. The whole town knew the lone rancher had just lit the fuse to a bloody war. If you love stories of the Wild West where honor matters more than safety, drop a 9 inches the comments and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. Shelter. The ride back was cold. Despite the Sunday, Silas kept the horses at a steady pace, not rushing, not slowing. Behind him, Ayanna sat silent among the supplies, her breathing harsh and wet. Every few minutes he glanced back. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just sat with her back straight, eyes fixed on the horizon they were leaving behind. The cabin came into view as the sun tilted west. It sat at the bottom of a long hill, small and stubborn against the vast emptiness of the prairie. Wood darkened by years of weather, windows narrow as rifle slits. A single chimney leaking thin smoke. Silas had built it himself after the war when he needed someplace quiet enough to forget. He stopped the wagon and climbed down. Ayanna didn't wait for help. She swung her legs over the side, dropped to the ground, and immediately stumbled. Her legs gave out, and she caught herself on the wagon wheel, breathing hard. The rope burns on her neck were dark purple, now weeping clear fluid. Silas reached for her arm. She jerked away so fast he heard her shoulder crack. Her eyes went hard wild. Her hand closed around a fist-sized rock near the wheel. He stopped, raised his hands slowly, palms out. "Just trying to help," he said quietly. She stared at him. The rock stayed in her hand. He nodded, stepped back, and gestured toward the cabin door. "It's warm inside. Fire's going. There's water." She didn't move, didn't speak. Just watched him like he was a wolf circling her campfire. Silas sighed, picked up his rifle, and walked to the cabin alone. He left the door open behind him. Inside, he built up the fire, set the kettle to boil, pulled out the spare blanket he kept for cold nights. He worked slowly, listening for footsteps. They came after a long silence, soft, uneven, cautious. He didn't turn around. Ayanna appeared in the doorway, still holding the rock. She looked around the cabin with quick, measuring glances. One room, one bed, one table, rifle pegs on the wall, a trunk in the corner. No other doors except the one she'd come through. Silas set the blanket on the chair near the fire, poured hot water into a tin cup, placed it on the table. Then he picked up his rifle, walked to the opposite corner of the room, and sat down with his back to the wall. "Take the bed if you want it," he said, "or the chair, or the floor. Your choice." She didn't respond, didn't move toward the fire. She backed slowly to the far wall, away from him and away from the door, and lowered herself to the floor. Her hand finally released the rock, but her eyes never left him. They sat like that for an hour. The fire crackled. Wind scratched at the windows. Outside, a coyote howled somewhere in the twilight. Finally, Silas stood slow and careful. He picked up the tin cup from the table, walked halfway across the room, and set it on the floor between them. Then he backed away to his corner again. "You don't trust me," he said. "Good. Neither would I." Her eyes flickered to the cup, then back to him. She didn't reach for it. Silas settled against the wall, rifle across his lap. "I'm going to close my eyes now. If you want to leave the doors open. If you want to kill me, there's knives in the drawer. If you want to stay." He paused. Then stay. He closed his eyes. Didn't sleep. Just listened. For a long time, nothing. Then, so faint he almost missed it, the scrape of a cup against wood. The sound of careful swallowing. A long, shaking exhale. When he opened his eyes again, the cup was empty on the floor, and Ayanna sat with her back to the wall, knees drawn up, watching him, with eyes that reflected the firelight like distant stars. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did he. Labor and silence morning came gray and cold. Silas woke to find Ayanna gone from her corner, and for a moment his heart kicked against his ribs. Then he heard the sound steady, rhythmic thuds from outside. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch. The air bit at his face sharp with the promise of early winter. And there at the barn was Ayanna driving a fence post into the frozen ground with a heavy mallet. She'd found his work gloves, pulled them on over her scraped hands. Her breath came out in white clouds. The rope burns on her neck were dark scabs, now ugly and raw. She didn't look at him, just lifted the mallet and swung again. The post sank deeper into the earth. Silas stood watching for a moment, then walked to the tool shed. He pulled out the wire spool, a handful of nails, his own hammer. When he reached the fence line, Ayanna was already setting the next post. They worked without speaking. He unrolled the wire. She held the post steady. He stretched the line taut. She drove the staples. When he needed to measure distance, she paced it off with long strides. When she needed the wire cutters, he handed them over without being asked. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning frost. Sweat soaked through Silas's shirt despite the cold. Ayanna worked without pause, her movements efficient and strong. Once when a post cracked under the mallet, she tossed it aside and fetched another before he could say anything. They stopped when the sun reached its peak. Silas pulled out a canteen, drank, then held it out to her. She looked at it for a long moment, then took it, drank, passed it back. Her fingers brushed his rough and cold. That's when he saw it. The rope burns on her throat he'd expected. But there, along her left side, beneath the torn deerskin dress, an old scar. Not from a rope, from a bullet. Healed over months old maybe, but distinct. Entry wound, just below the ribs. Who shot you? The question came out before he could stop it. Her eyes snapped to his heart as flint. She didn't answer, just turned and walked back to the fence line, picked up the mallet, and started working again. Silas stood there, canteen in hand, watching her back. The scar told a story she wasn't ready to share. Someone had tried to kill her before the hanging. Someone with a gun, not a noose. He screwed the cap back on the canteen and followed her to the fence. They worked until sunset painted the prairie gold and red. When they finally stopped, 300 feet of new fence stood between the cabin and the open range. Silas's hands were blistered. Ayanna's shoulders trembled with exhaustion. Inside the cabin, he built up the fire, boiled a pot of thin soup from dried beans and salt pork. He set 2 bowls on the table. She stood in the doorway watching, and he wondered if she'd eat at the table or take her bowl to the corner again. She walked to the table, sat down across from him, picked up the spoon. Before she ate, she did something that made Silas go still. She placed her palm flat against the wooden table, closed her eyes, and whispered something in Apache. Her lips moved silently, forming words he didn't understand. Then she touched her fingers to the floor, brief as a heartbeat, before sitting back up. She didn't explain, didn't look at him, just started eating. Silas ate his own soup, slowly watching the firelight play across her face. She had strong features, high cheekbones, a nose that had been broken and healed crooked. Scars marked her hands, old knife wounds, and burn marks. This was a woman who'd fought for every breath she'd ever taken. After they ate, she stood and walked to the corner again. But this time, she didn't sit with her back to the wall. She lay down on the floor, pulled the blanket he'd given her over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Silas cleared the bowls quietly, banked the fire, sat in his chair by the door with the Winchester across his lap. Outside wind howled like wolves on the ridge. Inside, for the first time in years, the cabin held 2 heartbeats instead of 1. As he started to close his eyes, he heard a sound so faint he almost thought he'd imagined it. Hoofbeats, far away, maybe a mile off. Coming closer, then fading again into the night. Someone had been watching the ranch. Someone knew she was here. Silas tightened his grip on the rifle. Across the room, Ayanna's eyes opened in the darkness, meeting his. No words were exchanged, but they both knew the hanging had been only the beginning. Broken past. 3 days passed in the same rhythm, work, silence, watchfulness. They repaired the barn roof, where winter wind had torn shingles loose. They hauled water from the creek, bucket after bucket, until Silas's shoulders burned. They split firewood the axe, rising and falling in steady tempo. And slowly, carefully, the distance between them began to shrink. On the fourth night, after another meal eaten in silence, Ayanna did something unexpected. She reached beneath her dress and pulled out a small leather pouch worn smooth by years of handling. She opened it carefully, and Silas saw a string of wooden beads spill into her palm. They were old, beautifully carved, each one slightly different. Some round, some oval. Dark wood, polished by countless fingers. She held them up to the firelight, and for the first time since he'd cut her down, her face softened. Her thumb traced each bead like she was reading a story written in wood. "My mother's," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, the words careful. Her English was better than he'd expected. Silas nodded. Didn't speak. Didn't want to break whatever was happening. Ayanna's eyes went distant, focused on something beyond the cabin walls. Her hands trembled slightly. "She gave them to me the night they came." The fire crackled. Wind pressed against the windows. And then she wasn't in the cabin anymore. The memory came like a flood she couldn't stop. She was younger, maybe 20 winters. Standing outside her family's lodge under a sky so thick with stars, it looked like spilled salt. The night was warm, late summer, and the smell of sage smoke hung in the air. He came walking through the camp, the chief's son, tall and proud in his ceremonial deerskin shirt, eagle feathers woven into his long hair. He stopped in front of her lodge, extended his hand. "You honor me," he said in Apache. "You honor our people." She looked at his hand, at his face, at the crowd of relatives gathering behind him, smiling expectant. "No," she said. The word dropped like a stone into still water. Ripples spread outward. The smiles faltered. The chief's son's hand stayed extended, frozen in midair. "No," he repeated like he didn't understand the word. "I will not marry you." His face darkened. Behind him, elders began to murmur. Her father pushed through the crowd, face tight with fury and shame. "You will honor this match," her father said. "It is decided." "You decided," she answered. "Not me." Her father's hand cracked across her face. She didn't fall, didn't touch her cheek, just stood there tall and defiant while blood trickled from her split lip. "Then you are no daughter of mine." They came for her that night. Not enemies, not soldiers. Her own people. 6 warriors dragged her from the lodge, while her mother screamed and clawed at their arms. Someone struck her mother down. The last thing Ayanna saw before they bound her hands was her mother crawling through the dirt, holding the string of beads, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Take them," her mother gasped in Apache. "Remember who you are." The beads were pressed into Ayanna's tied hands. Then darkness, rope, the long ride to Bitter Creek, where the Apache elders had arranged for the white man's justice to finish what they'd started. Because if she wouldn't belong to the tribe through marriage, she wouldn't belong to it at all. Ayanna blinked, and she was back in the cabin. The beads were slippery in her palms, wet with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. Silas sat across from her, his gray eyes steady, waiting. "They didn't hang me because I stole," she said quietly. "They hanged me because I said no." Silas was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Saying no," he said slowly, "is the bravest thing a person can do." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, saw the scars on his knuckles, the way his coat was patched at the shoulders, the loneliness carved into the lines around his eyes. "Why did you cut the rope?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the fire. "I spent 4 years in a war being told who to shoot and when. Spent 2 more years watching my wife die slow from fever, while I couldn't do a damn thing to help." He paused. "I'm tired of standing by while the world takes what it wants." Outside, the wind shifted. And then came the sound that made them both go, rigid hoofbeats. Not one horse. Many. Coming fast. Silas stood, grabbed his Winchester. Ayanna shoved the beads back into their pouch, tied it around her neck, and reached for the splitting axe leaning by the door. Through the window, they saw them, torches bobbing in the darkness. 8 riders, maybe more. And leading them, his face twisted with rage in the firelight, was Deputy Morrison. Coulter Morrison's voice rang out across the yard. "Open the door. Bring out that monster, and you may yet live." Silas moved to the window, rifle raised. Ayanna positioned herself by the side door, axe gripped in both hands. Their eyes met across the room. He gave her a single nod. She returned it. Morrison's voice came again, louder, angrier. "You know she's not human, Coulter. She's a monster. She'll kill you in your sleep." Silas's answer was low, cold, and absolute. "Tonight whoever crosses this fence will not live to see tomorrow." The first gunshot shattered the window. Siege glass exploded inward. Silas dropped below the window frame, rifle braced against his shoulder. Another shot splintered the door frame. Then another. The cabin filled with the smell of gunpowder and splintered pine. Surround them, Morrison screamed from somewhere in the darkness. "Burn them out." Ayanna didn't wait. She kicked the side door open and lunged into the night like a thunderstorm given form. The splitting axe caught firelight as she swung, and the nearest torch went flying, spraying embers across a man's face. He screamed, stumbling backward, pawing at his burning beard. Silas rolled to the broken window and fired. Once. Twice. Clean shots. 2 riders dropped into the dust, their horses wheeling in panic. Morrison cursed, hauling his mount around behind the water trough for cover. "Get the oil," Morrison bellowed. "Burn them out." A glass bottle arced through the air, trailing a rag fuse. It smashed against the cabin wall, and flame roared to life, crawling up the weathered wood like a living thing. Heat blasted through the broken window. Silas lurched to his feet, grabbed the wool blanket from his bed, and beat at the flames. Smoke filled his lungs. His eyes watered. The fire climbed higher, reaching for the roof. Then Ayanna was there beside him, her own blanket in hand, smothering flames with brutal efficiency. Her face was smeared with ash and blood, someone else's blood. The splitting axe was gone, replaced with a rifle she must have taken from one of the fallen men. They worked back to back, Silas beating flames, Ayanna covering the approaches, firing carefully measured shots that drove Morrison's men back into the darkness. "There's too many," Silas shouted over the roar of fire and gunshots. Ayanna's answer was to grab a burning piece of wood from the cabin wall and hurl it like a spear toward the cluster of horses. It landed among them in a shower of sparks. The animals panicked, rearing and bucking, scattering Morrison's carefully planned attack into chaos. The fight raged through the long hours of darkness. Silas lost track of shots, fired men driven back, flames extinguished only to spark up again somewhere new. His hands were burned. His lungs felt full of smoke and ground glass. Beside him, Ayanna fought with the cold efficiency of someone who'd been doing it her entire life. At some point, Morrison himself charged forward on horseback, pistol blazing. Silas fired. The deputy's hat flew off. Morrison yanked his horse around, cursing, and retreated into the smoke-shrouded darkness. "You won't hold her for long," Coulter Morrison's voice echoed from somewhere beyond the firelight. "We'll be back. And next time, we'll bring the whole territory." Then hoofbeats fading. The attackers melting away into the pre-dawn darkness, like bad dream. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of dying flames and the harsh rasp of Silas's breathing. He collapsed against the cabin wall, rifle clattering from his burned hands. The eastern sky was turning gray. Bodies lay scattered in the yard, 2, maybe 3. Dead horses. Spent shell casings glinting in the ash. Ayanna stood in the center of the destruction chest, heaving the stolen rifle still held ready. Her deerskin dress was torn and blackened. Blood ran from a gash on her arm, but her eyes were clear, cold, steady as winter stars. She looked at the carnage, then at Silas, then at the cabin, half its wall burned, black roof sagging. "They will return," she said quietly. Silas nodded, too exhausted to speak. She drove the rifle butt into the ground, like a staff planted there in the ash and blood. "When they do," she said, "we will be ready." And despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the knowledge that worse was coming, Silas felt something unexpected bloom in his chest. Not quite hope, more like recognition. He wasn't alone anymore. Neither was she. As the sun broke over the horizon, painting the scorched prairie in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together in the ruins of the siege, 2 scarred souls who'd chosen defiance over safety. The real battle, they both knew, had only just begun. Defiance. The sun climbed higher, but the smoke never quite cleared. It hung over the cabin like a shroud, marking the place where 8 men had tried to drag a woman back to a noose. Silas spent the morning hauling bodies. Not into graves, the ground was too frozen, and he owed these men nothing. He dragged them to the edge of his property line and left them there for Morrison to collect. A message this far, no farther. Ayanna worked on the cabin. She salvaged boards from the damaged wall, hammered them into place with short, precise strikes. When Silas tried to help, she shook her head and pointed him toward the fence line. Another post had fallen during the attack. They worked in separate silences until midday, when exhaustion finally dragged them both inside. Silas boiled coffee, real coffee this time, from the bag he'd never bought in town. The smell filled the cabin, rich and bitter. He poured 2 cups, slid one across the scorched table. Ayanna wrapped both hands around the tin cup, let the heat soak into her palms. For a long time she just stared into the black liquid. Then she spoke, her voice rough as winter wind. "I should leave." Silas looked up sharply. "They will keep coming," she continued. "Killing your livestock, burning your home, marking you as outcast." Her dark eyes met his. "I bring only death to this place." "You didn't ask me to cut that rope." "No," she agreed. "But you did." Silas took a long drink of scalding coffee. It burned all the way down, and he welcomed the pain. Something simple, something clean. "I've been alone in this cabin for 6 years," he said finally. 6 years of talking to fence posts and horses. 6 years of waking up and forgetting for just a second that I'm the only person for 20 miles in any direction. He set the cup down harder than he meant to. "You think a few burned boards are worse than that?" Ayanna was quiet. Outside, a hawk cried, distant and sharp. "They will not stop," she said. "Neither will we." She studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, something older and sadder. "You are a fool, Silas Walker." It was the first time she'd used his name. He hadn't even realized she knew it. "Yeah," he agreed. "Probably." She drank her coffee in silence. When she finished, she stood and walked to the corner where she'd been sleeping. She knelt, pulled out the leather pouch with her mother's beads, and held them up to the thin sunlight, filtering through the smoke-stained windows. "Among my people," she said quietly, "these beads were meant to be worn only by married women. A symbol of belonging to family, to clan, to the unbroken line of mothers and daughters." She turned them slowly, watching light play across the worn wood. "When I refused the match, I broke that line." Silas said nothing, watched. "But belonging," Ayanna continued, "belonging is not something given by others. It is something chosen." "Yes, yes," Silas said simply. She walked to the small wooden cradle sitting empty by the hearth, left over from the wife he'd lost, the child who'd never been born. Gently, reverently, she placed the string of beads across it. The old wood gleamed against the scarred pine. "If I stay," she said, still looking at the beads, "it is my choice. No one else's." Silas stood, walked to his trunk in the corner. He opened it, slowly pulled out something he hadn't touched in years, an old wool shawl, deep blue, his mother's. She'd worn it every winter of his childhood, wrapped it around both of them when storms came. He'd kept it after she died, unable to let go. He carried it to the cradle and laid it beside the beads. Old wool and old wood. 2 histories woven together. "Then this is your home," he said, "for as long as you choose it." The silence that followed was different from all the silences before. Not emptiness, not weariness, something else. Something that felt like the moment before a seed breaks open underground. Ayanna reached out and placed her large, scarred hand over his calloused one. Neither spoke. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying away the last of the smoke. That night, she didn't sleep in the corner. She took the bed he'd insisted, and finally, she'd stopped arguing. Silas made a pallet by the door with extra blankets, rifle close at hand. Just before full dark, Ayanna began to sing. It was quiet at first, barely more than a hum. Then words came rising and falling in patterns Silas didn't understand. Apache words, old words, formed low in her throat and released like birds taking flight. The melody was strange and beautiful, full of spaces and silences that meant as much as the notes. He didn't ask what she was singing, didn't need to. Some things transcend language. When she finished, the cabin felt different. cleaner somehow, like the song had swept out old ghosts and made room for something new. "What was that?" he asked quietly. "A song my mother taught me," Ayanna said from the darkness. "For when you must make a new home in a hard place." Silas closed his eyes, let the last echoes of the melody wash over him. "It's beautiful." "Yes," she agreed. "And it is mine to give." Outside, coyotes called to each other across the frozen prairie, but inside the cabin the fire burned steady and warm. Two people, two histories, one shared choice. Out here in the Wild West, love wasn't declared with words. It was built with split wood mended fences, and the choice to stay when leaving would be easier. These were the true Wild West stories, not of gunslingers and gold, but of cowboy stories where a man's honor was measured by who he stood beside. And perhaps that's what Wild West love truly was, not a rescue, but a shared defiance against a world that demanded you choose sides. The next morning brought something neither of them expected: dust on the eastern horizon. Not 8 riders this time. 30, maybe more. And they weren't coming from Bitter Creek. They were coming from Apache territory. Belonging. The dust rose like a signal fire against the pale morning sky. Silas stood on the porch, Winchester in hand, watching the riders approach. Beside him, Ayanna had gone perfectly still, her body tensed like a bowstring. "Your people," Silas said quietly. "Yes. You want me to stand down?" She looked at him, and for just a moment he saw fear flicker across her face. Not of the riders, of something deeper. "No," she said, "stand with me." So they stood together as 30 Apache warriors circled the burned cabin. The horses were magnificent, painted and proud, moving with the fluid grace of animals who'd been born to open country. The riders sat tall, faces hard as carved stone, hands resting on weapons that had tasted blood for generations. At their head rode an elder, his hair streaked with iron gray, his face carved by 60 winters of survival. He wore a ceremonial shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, and he carried a staff topped with eagle feathers. When he spoke, his voice rolled across the frozen ground like distant thunder. He spoke in Apache, rapid and formal. Ayanna translated quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The chief says, 'Daughter of the earth, you should have died. Why do you still draw breath?'" Silas kept his rifle pointed at the ground, but his fingers stayed near the trigger. 30 against 2. If this went wrong, they'd have maybe 10 seconds. Ayanna stepped forward, leaving the safety of the porch. She stood alone in the circle of horses, tall and unbroken, her voice carrying across the distance. She spoke in Apache, strong and clear. Silas didn't understand the words, but he heard the defiance in them. The absolute refusal to bend. The chief's face darkened. Warriors shifted hands, moving toward weapons. The old man raised his staff, and his voice cracked like breaking ice. Ayanna translated her eyes, never leaving the chief's face. "He says I dishonored my father, refused the sacred match, brought shame to the people, that I now stand with the white man and have become a traitor to my blood." The circle tightened. Horses snorted, stamping in the cold. Silas raised his Winchester slightly. If they charged, he'd take down the chief first, maybe 3 more before they overran the cabin. Not enough. Never enough. The chief spoke again, his words sharp as obsidian blades. Ayanna's translation came quieter this time. "Choose. Return and face judgment, or die here beside your protector." The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Silas tightened his grip on the rifle, ready to make good on his promise. If Ayanna died today, Morrison's men wouldn't be the only ones hunting him. He'd turned his back on his own people too. But Ayanna didn't choose silence. She stepped forward into the center of the circle and spoke. The words came in English this time, clear, deliberate, meant for both audiences. "I will not return. I choose to stay." She gestured to the cabin, to Silas, to the burned fence and blood-stained ground. "Not for this land, not for this wooden cabin, but because here, for the first time in my life, I am seen as a person. Not a daughter to be traded, not a warrior to be commanded, not a shame to be erased. A person." The translation came after Ayanna, repeating her words in Apache. When she finished, the silence was absolute. The chief sat motionless on his horse. His weathered hand gripped the ceremonial staff so hard his knuckles went white. The warriors around him waited tense as drawn bowstring. Then slowly the chief lowered his staff. "If you make this choice," he said, in careful English the first time he'd used it, "then you are no longer daughter of the people. We will not protect you. We will not claim you. You are dust on the wind." He turned his horse. The circle began to break apart warriors, wheeling away one by one. But before he left, the chief looked back at Ayanna one final time. His eyes were hard, but something else flickered beneath the anger, something that might have been sorrow. "You were the strongest of us," he said quietly. "It is a loss we will feel for generations." Then he rode away, and the 30 warriors followed, disappearing into the eastern hills like ghosts fading at dawn. Ayanna stood alone in their dust shoulders, shaking. Not from fear, from the magnitude of what she'd just done. She'd cut every tie, burned every bridge. There was no tribe to return to now, no family to take her back. She'd chosen her own path, and the cost was everything she'd been born into. Silas lowered his rifle and walked to her. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, just stood beside her as the dust settled and the morning grew quiet again. Finally, Ayanna turned to him. Her eyes were dry but haunted. "I have nothing now," she said. "No," Silas corrected gently. "You have a choice. That's more than most people get." She looked at the cabin, scorched, damaged, stubborn, then at him, gray-eyed, scarred, equally stubborn. A slow breath escaped her, and with it some of the terrible weight lifted from her shoulders. "Then let us make this choice mean something," she said. They spent the rest of the day working, repairing, rebuilding. The fence posts Silas had been fighting with for weeks went up faster with Ayanna's strength behind them. The burned wall got new boards hammered into place with steady rhythm. By sunset the cabin looked almost whole again. That evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sky turn from gold to deep purple. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, empty and beautiful, and absolutely indifferent to human suffering. "Tell me about your wife," Ayanna said quietly. Silas was surprised by the question, but after everything they'd been through, hiding felt pointless. "Sarah," he said. "We met after the war. She was a doctor's daughter, educated, beautiful. Thought she could civilize me." A ghost of a smile touched his face. "Came damn close. What happened? Fever. Took her slow. Took the baby before it was born." He was quiet for a moment. "I built this cabin for them. Thought we'd have a life here. Instead, I got 6 years of talking to myself." Ayanna nodded slowly. "My mother told me once that the hardest thing is not losing someone. It is learning to build a new life in the emptiness they leave behind. Your mother was wise." "Yes." Ayanna touched the beads around her neck. "I think she would have liked you. You are stubborn like her. I'll take that as a compliment." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared. The wind had finally died down, leaving the prairie quiet and still. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked. Silas considered. "Morrison will come back eventually. Your people won't help us. The whole territory thinks I'm a traitor." He paused. "But we've got a roof, a fence, and enough stubbornness for 10 people. I figure that's enough to start with." Ayanna smiled then, a real smile, small and fragile but genuine. "Yes," she agreed. "It is enough." As darkness fell, they went inside together. Silas built up the fire. Ayanna made a simple meal from the supplies they had left. They ate at the table side by side instead of across from each other. Before she went to bed, Ayanna took her mother's beads from the cradle and held them for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed them in Silas's calloused hand. "The rope they used to hang me," she said quietly, "was meant to bind me to death. But this string of beads," she closed his fingers around them, "this binds me to life, to choice, to you." Silas looked down at the worn wooden beads, each one carrying generations of history. "I'm honored," he said simply. "Good." She stepped back. "Then tomorrow we finish the fence. And the day after we build it stronger. And the day after that we make this place truly ours." "Together," Silas said. "Together," she agreed. That night the cabin was quiet but not empty. 2 people slept under its patched roof. 2 histories wove together in the darkness. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly cold and unforgiving, but inside something new had taken root. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but something just as important, the recognition that survival.